Hello and welcome to the Educating Character Initiative webinar series. We're so grateful for your presence with us today. My name is Aaron Cobb. I'm Senior Scholar of Character for the Educating
That's
Character
weird.
Initiative,
Hi.
and it's my privilege
I
to
don't even know
host
where it is.
today. And it's a privilege to welcome you all to our fourth of the series for this fall semester. I want to start with a few announcements before we move on to our conversation with Suzanne Shanahan. The first announcement is, as we do with all of our webinars, is I would just like to invite you to join the ECI community. There's a strong chance if you're here that you've already joined the community, but invite your colleagues. If you have friends and colleagues that are working with you on projects at your own campus, we'd love for them to be part of the community as well. So please extend that invitation to them. Second, a recording of this webinar with captions will be available in our archive within a week of the event. So we're not permitting AI transcribers during this event. If you have an accessibility need or have any questions, please get in touch with us at eci@wfu.edu. Third, our request for proposals is live, our next funding initiative. You'll find a link to the RFP in the chat. And our next information session about the RFP is this week on Thursday. Please register for a chance to hear from us at that general information session. And we have a couple more coming up in December and January as well. Fourth, and finally, for announcements today, just a quick reminder that our final session for our webinar series this fall is on December 9th. This session will feature a conversation with 4 principal investigators of current institutional impact grants who recently organized a convening for faith-based institutions to discuss the distinctive challenges and opportunities of character formation efforts in those contexts. We'll hear from PIs at George Fox University, Hope College, Seattle Pacific University, and Whitworth University. You should find a link to register in the chat. And then please pay attention to the November newsletter where we'll be announcing our spring 2026 webinar series. That's enough for announcements. Let's move to today's featured guest and today's conversation. We're excited today to host an interview and conversation with Suzanne Shanahan, the Leo and Arlene Hawk Executive Director at the Institute for Social Concerns and Professor of Sociology at the University of Notre Dame. She also leads the Virtues and Vocations Initiative, a national forum seeking to cultivate character, purpose, and meaning in pre-professional and professional education. Her research focuses on understanding the refugee experience in East Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia, with special attention to how displaced persons construct moral boundaries around what is right, just, and fair. Her current research also examines the causes and consequences of domestic child sex trafficking for children and families in the United States. We've structured today's webinar as a conversation, so I'm going to invite Suzanne to engage with me for approximately 25 to 30 minutes, after which we'll have an opportunity for questions and conversations from the community. When I open it to the community, I'd love for you to raise the questions in your own voice. If you'd rather put the questions in the chat, that's fine too. We'll be moderating the chat and we'll do our best to catch your questions and bring them forward. Suzanne, welcome. We're excited to learn from you.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me. This will be fun.
Good. So I want to structure this interview around 3 kinds of categories of questions. So the first category is around your work, your research, and your practices related to character building for the common good. The second is around community and culture building, mentoring, leadership in the spaces of character-centered programming where you work. And then the third question is around the discipline, the distinctive ways the discipline of sociology helps us to understand character formation and character building efforts. So those are roughly the 3 categories. But I'd like to start, if you could, just describe briefly the work you do for the Institute for Social Concerns and with Virtues and Vocation in relation to its focus on character and the common good.
Great. So, as you said, I direct something called the Institute for Social Concerns, and we consider ourselves the scholarly home for the pursuit of justice on Notre Dame's campus. We work in student formation, research for the common good, and we also engage in a range of collaborations with community. As part of this work, we really understand it to be an expression of the mission of a Catholic university, We also consider this work to be animated by a normative proposition. That proposition is that a just world is a beautiful world. Um, and we bring together people from across campus, from the community, students, and collaboratively develop projects together. For me, there's a really important connection between the work of justice and the work of character in the common good. When we think about the pursuit of justice, it's really the pursuit of justice and the common good. If we imagine the common good to be a state where your well-being is contingent on my well-being and vice versa, that we can't truly flourish as a community or as a society without mutual flourishing of everyone, justice then becomes really central to that work. And so for us, justice and the common good are intertwined. Virtues and Vocations, in its work with pre-professionals and professional education, then is about understanding the virtues and the characteristics, the ways of being in the world that are essential for the pursuit of justice and the effectuation of common good in societies. So for me, they're all kind of intertwined, if you will.
Hmm. I'm interested. I want to come back to this in a little bit in the connection you see between justice and beauty. I'd love to hear more little bit more about that. But before we get there, I want to ask you some questions about sort of how you got to where you are. So I'm interested in how about your research and your experiences working with vulnerable populations. Can you describe some of those efforts, what it's taught you about really what it means to form people with deep commitments to serve the common good?
So I think in some ways, I backed into a research stream working with refugees, but also victims and survivors of trafficking in some ways. And this was really work that I began at Duke University when it became clear that refugees were resettling in very large numbers to North Carolina. And I had a colleague who was very interested in how refugees would be able to resettle to that area, an area that probably wasn't super well prepared for the significant influx of folks from many, many different countries with many, many different life experiences and speaking different languages. And we wanted to know what that transition would look like, but decided we should really start by understanding sort of the home of first displacement. So many people will be displaced from a particular country, spend time in a refugee camp, or in a country that is not their own before coming to the United States. And so what does that first experience look like? And then how does it prepare them or not prepare them to resettle in the United States? And I think my introduction to this work was really very much a trial by fire. I had the foolhardy idea that a group of freshmen and I was teaching a freshman seminar, that we would sponsor a Bhutanese refugee family as they came into the United States. And we would collaborate with a local resettlement agency and sort of work through that process together and learn together, but also simultaneously support a family. And I think this was, I say, a foolhardy exercise because I don't think any of us were prepared with the challenges that this young family would face upon arrival in the United States. It was a family of five, a mother who had just turned 30, and her children who were 14, 10, 5, and 1. So a single mother coming to the United States. They arrived at Raleigh-Durham Airport with nothing except a bag of documentation. They didn't have a change of clothing. They had no diapers, no toys, nothing but a bag of documentation, and arrived in the United States with a mother who was both illiterate and innumerate. And when I say innumerate, what I mean is she didn't know the difference between 1, 10, and 50. She had zero schooling and had never lived on her own. And so she was coming to the United States with an expectation that her children would be quickly enrolled in school, she would quickly get a job, and they would become self-sustaining. That fantastical notion really hit home and hard very, very quickly. And I think for myself, but all the students involved, this became really an extraordinary moment to walk alongside people who we would never have been able to walk alongside, but also experience what it's like to show up at a public school to try to register your children when you don't speak English, to try to figure out how to get free lunch when there's a 30-day waiting period, statutory waiting period, to get free breakfast and lunch at North Carolina schools. When you have no other source of breakfast and lunch, but are still told you need to wait 30 days. And I think it was really confronting this particular family's experience that launched a series of projects in East Africa, in the Middle East, trying to understand the implications of displacement for refugees and trafficked persons, but then also understanding the profound secondary trauma that people experience when coming to the United States. I think resettlement is one of the most profound moral commitments the United States has made in the post-World War II era. I am devastated that we have backed off that moral commitment. But I think it would be foolish to imagine that our willingness to take people into the United States means that all is good and well for them. The integration and the attempt to try to flourish in a place you know no one. It's in a place where you don't know how to go shopping. You've never been on a public bus. Your children have never gone to school on a bus. That all of those things are immensely, immensely challenging. And witnessing this and experiencing it alongside this extraordinary family for both me and the students really kind of triggered something and a trajectory of work that's really animated me. It's also clear that first group of students, I still talk to them regularly. This had the most extraordinary and profound impact on them. And it was really a range of projects we developed as a class, but then really as a group of, at points, up to 400 Duke undergraduates participating to provide kind of school support. So kids in primary school, just reading, writing, the basics, but also for women who were learning language skills, small business development, GED, how to get your driver's license, how would you potentially apply to college, how do you go to a dentist? Many people had never been to a dentist. What's a dentist like? Bringing in dentists to explain what that process is, going to people to health appointments and those sorts of things. That walking alongside, I think, had a profound impact on folks' moral development, and they described it in those terms. So they felt that they became more compassionate, more generous. They felt that they developed a strong sense of empathy or moral imagination. And it was really listening to the students that got me thinking of this relationship between sort of, as Pope Francis would describe it, going to the margins and walking alongside or being proximate with the poor, the suffering, and how that itself really drives moral development for many students. And I would say that's sort of where my interest in character developed. In fairness, at the time, I was working at an ethics institute, so it wasn't as if character was orthogonal to what I was doing, but I would say at the time, the language of character at Duke University was language nobody used and nobody really wanted to use. It felt normative in a judgmental way, and yet students themselves started bringing that language forward. And so I learned from students, as we often do.
Could you say a little bit more about that in terms of like how the students were describing their own formation in that context? So, especially, I'm thinking of that first class that you did this work with. Like, what was it like to sort of just start hearing them talk in those terms, and what did they how did they describe that experience?
Um, So I think that they in many ways, it started to happen informally, and then we moved more systematically to kind of survey students alongside the experience. But um, that first cohort, it was about 15 students who really took charge, and uh, there were some significant catastrophic health issues with this family. They organized 24-hour sort of kind of rotations to be with the family, to provide support really constantly over a 6 to 8 month period. And when talking about that experience, they talked about, right, how it cultivated a sense of humility. That for the first time they realized in a profound way the limits of what it is to be a really smart, really capable student at a world-class university. That um, all their hard work, all their ingenuity, all their skills still could not resolve some fundamental challenges that a family and really indeed a broad community was having at this time. And so I think the first language was about humility. I think then people began to talk about the importance of compassion. Um, that I think for me, for my family, because we were all involved in this project, I think uh, this family of five at various points lived with my family. Thank goodness I am married to a literal saint who was like, yeah, bring them on down. My children were involved. I think it was incredibly exhausting and overwhelming navigating the challenges this family faced. But I think throughout that, people kept talking about the exercise of compassion and the need to constantly be vigilant about being compassionate and not letting fatigue or frustration with systems and processes undermine that compassion. Um, I think the third piece was the development of a profound notion of empathy. And we talked a lot about how empathy was kind of, right, the relationship between empathy and moral imagination. So I I recall this one moment in going to register um, three of the four kids for school, and I was with the mom, and she was with the baby, and I was with a student, and yeah, the student and I stayed in the car with the baby, dropped the family at the front door so we could park the car and bring the baby in. And so they came into the school and were standing where the principal was. And it took us forever to park the car. So it was probably like 10, 15 minutes before we got in. And the family was standing there in front of a desk that had three people working there. And they had been standing there for 15 minutes. Nobody asked who they were. Nobody offered assistance. They just stood there, invisible. And I think for the student and I to experience that, to experience invisibility in that profound a way, I think is one of the kinds of experiences that created this sense of moral imagination, that we could feel what it was like to stand in a public space, in a public school, and not be seen, not seen at all. And I think that's the kind of experiences that we consistently had. We had the same experience in the hospital when a very eager young surgeon wanted to amputate the mother's leg. And it was easier to amputate or try to amputate her leg than it was to try to explain to her, right, what the treatment would be like and how to rehabilitate it. And the notion that you would take a 29, 30-year-old woman with four children who had just moved to the United States and amputate her leg because you didn't think she could be responsible for the care she would need is a pretty horrendous thing. And it's those experiences of coming alongside someone and experiencing it truly with them that I think cultivated this sensibility and this appreciation of character. Um, yeah.
That's great. I want to talk a little bit more. Some of the language that you've used here, I think, is really helpful. You've talked about a sort of an animating concern for justice, but you've also noted like some of the language around character is fraught, and it's not always, accessible, or it's sometimes people are hesitant or skeptical about the language of character. So I'm wondering if you might say a little bit more about how justice animates your concern for the common good, or how it animates your concern in thinking about more broadly programming of the sort you've just described, both at Institute for Social Concerns and your previous work. And then say a little bit more about how, when you talk with folks about character, and they might be skeptical or hesitant about that language, I wonder if how you might approach those sorts of conversations with those who are skeptical or worried. So.
Yeah, so a couple of things. I, I think our approach to justice at the Institute for Social Concerns, I think it's important to note sometimes we talk about justice and um, it connotes a particular politics. And I think very much so the Institute is operating from Catholic social tradition, where an Aristotelian notion of justice is front and center. And so it's really about discerning what is the right thing to do. And I think of the work of Rawls or Sandel in this way of thinking. It's also when I think about justice, I think about literature oftentimes. And one of the novels I always have students read in a class I teach about justice is Anthony Doerr's All the Light We Cannot See. And book that says, how do we ever really know we're doing the right thing? And so for me and for folks at the Institute, in our working community, that's the question we're always asking. How do we know we're doing the right thing? And it's less that we know, but that we are discerning at all points what that is. How do we listen to the voices of others? How do we collaborate with others to move toward what is right, just, and fair in this world? And I think that's a bit of the animation for the work of justice. Um, there's this beautiful line in an essay Hannah Arendt wrote about education, where she talks about education as the moment at which we take responsibility for the world. Um, and that's really what we're hoping to achieve with students, but with faculty and community members, that how do we take a responsibility for what happens in our community on a regular basis? And for me, that's the exercise of justice. And justice is one of the characteristics of what the common good needs to be, that you can't flourish and I can't flourish together if one of us is experiencing a significant state of injustice or radical inequality or some such. And so that's kind of the way I connect those dots a little bit. Um, it's funny, the language of character. Um, I would say, being at Notre Dame, that has for 200 years been having an ongoing conversation about the importance of character. I can talk about character all day long here. And right, people nod their head. People are excited to talk about character. That's staff, that's community members, that's students, faculty. Um, I often find that character might be like one of those terms that everybody loves, but nobody's really sure what it is. So the task is unpacking it and getting people to fully understand what that means. I would say in other environments, sometimes people are like, ooh, character. And imagine that it's an a priori set of judgments that I'm trying to make or engage with. And that's not how I think about it. And so in all our work, we try to meet people where they are and say, what is it you're trying to do? And use their words to get to character. Um, I think I find it very rare that faculty or educators in general don't want the best for their students. I think, right, that's sort of a sine qua non for educators. They really want the best for them. They want them to be successful. They want them to flourish. And so I start with those terms to get them toward a notion of character, but always really starting where people are and moving them along. Um, and I find that in the course of many conversations, we can start with an anxiety about character and end in a place where people feel very comfortable, right? I think, again, educators want their students to pursue excellence. They want to be excellent engineers and excellent human beings. And being an excellent human being, they understand is part of what it means to be an excellent engineer. And the two are interrelated. And so it's walking people along that path. I'd say this really, the other piece that I find fascinating is students love this language that I find. And it's not just students at a Catholic university. I find many students are longing for sort of a way of thinking, a way of being that is about the pursuit of excellence, both in what they do and how they do it. Oftentimes here at the Institute, we talk about the how as the wow. How do I be a good person in this world? Students really are longing for meaning, purpose, and so character gives them sort of a language for that that I think they find incredibly satisfying. I know we talk about, you know, the current generation and all the challenges and all the things. Like, I find it extraordinarily hopeful, the extent to which students bring characters to the table, or when it's on the table, they gobble it up.
Hmm. That's great. I would think I want to pivot right now to thinking about the work you're doing right now and building culture and community at Notre Dame and thinking deeply about this work. And I think this actually brings me back to the statement you made earlier about the connection between justice and beauty.
Mhm.
And in part because so many of my colleagues have described the culture and the community they felt in when they've come to a Virtues and Vocations conference or when they've been sort of within the Institute for Social Concerns. Some of the words they've used are this is a joyful, hospitable, beautiful, collaborative, relational space. And I'm wondering if you can just share a little bit about how you have sought to develop that kind of culture and those kinds of commitments in your work through the work at Institute for Social Concerns.
So I think they're different, but like in my mind, there are a couple of different pieces that come together. So um, the emphasis on beauty, I think is part of a set of long-standing conversations that have emerged through the arts and through literature around notions, you know, sort of Dostoevsky's The Idiot, right? Can beauty save the world? That sort of notion coming through a literary tradition about how beauty creates an opening, a hopefulness, an inspiration that makes things that we might think impossible possible. And so I think the beauty piece is rooted in that. It's also that we very deliberatively use art to welcome, to be suggestive. And that's really sort of an ethos around hospitality. And we talk about a notion of radical hospitality here that we are very particular on the details of something. So when anyone comes to the Institute, we want them to feel a sense of home. We want them to feel seen, and we want them to feel a part of something bigger. And sometimes at the Institute, right, we make cookies 2 to 3 times a week. We have a student who freshly bakes cookies. We want you to feel like this is like your house, and you can come and you can sit and you can have a conversation and be heard and seen. We have art in the Institute that was collaboratively done with local artists, students, and the facilities workers. Notre Dame, like many universities, has an army of housekeeping staff that are invisible. How do we make those those folks visible? And how do we have an extraordinary mural celebrating that work? Um, that, and this is really, I would say, this notion of radical hospitality is something in keeping with the Catholic social tradition, but also something that was really important to our work with refugees in Durham and at Duke University. Um, we, I, we used to talk all the time about when people would come, about 500 people every Tuesday night to the Institute to work on various projects, refugees from the community, and we would serve fruit and students would go buy the fruit. And I don't know how many times I had to send students back to replace the apples, because if it was the one piece of fruit somebody was going to have all week, I wanted the best, beautiful apples. I didn't care if it took them 2 hours to sort through every single apple at the local supermarket, because if they were going to get an apple, we wanted someone to know that somebody took time to get that apple for you, and that you were seen and your situation was understood and somebody was going to respect that. And I think that's the ethos of much of what we do. We talk a lot about napkins, which I know sounds ridiculous, but how do you have a napkin that says, this is what the event is about, this is what we're trying to achieve, and you deserve something beautiful in your day. You're worth that. And so I think those are some of the elements. I'd also say the joy piece, again, comes from a slightly different angle. I think I've changed how I think about this. At Duke University, I used to talk a lot about fun. That we weren't doing neurosurgery, it wasn't life or death, that our work should be fun on a day-to-day basis. There should be whimsy, we should feel happy at work. And I think I completely drunk the Ross Gay Kool-Aid on delight and on joy, and really believe that this notion of joy should be a way to animate us. It's not frivolous happiness. It's about community, and it's about recognition of something shared and something profound.
Mm.
And so those are the elements, but they come from slightly different angles, if you will.
I love that. I love thinking about all of the ways. So hospitality has this deep justice component, but it also has this deep warmth and joyful component they're connected in those deep relational ways.
Yeah,
We're at the point now, we're almost ready to transition to conversation and questions from the ECI
great.
community as a whole. And I want to finish my structured set of questions with some thoughts about sociology as a discipline and
Mhm.
as it connects with our work in the broader educating character field. At present, we have a little over 40 disciplinary fields represented in the ECI community. Those tend to cluster around three main areas. So philosophy, religious studies, theology, and psychology. We have a small group of folks who are approaching questions about character and character formation from a sociological lens. And so I'm interested in how the discipline of sociology sort of shapes your vision for what it means to develop character programming in higher ed. What do you think is distinctive about sociology as an approach in this space? And maybe how it's impacted even thinking about the sort of structures and systems that you've created in the development of your programming.
Okay, so I confess I am a sociological evangelist. I think sociology is by far the best discipline because it gives you a set of tools to understand the world around you. And I think in some sense, that's critical to the cultivation of character. We need to be able to understand the context within which character might flourish. I also think of myself as someone who is not professionally a sociologist, but ontologically, or it is deeply, deeply part of my personhood. And I walk through the day sociologically. People talk about a sociological imagination and a way of thinking. And for me, this notion of a way of being is essential to the cultivation of character. I think that character is not something we want people to be able to turn on and turn off. We don't want people to be able to answer the right question at the right time under the right circumstances. we want people, right, to have an extraordinary sense of practical wisdom that they carry around with them in the world. And so in many ways, the approach that sociology offers, I think, is a really profound mechanism for the cultivation of character. Um, it's also that I think of sociology as a way of problem solving. So you see a situation in the world, and the question is, what's going on and why? And is this particularistic or is this generalizable? And I think that is one way that we can see the challenges and the absence of character and where character might come in and remediate a particular situation. I'd also say that sociology as a discipline is probably not as normative as something like theology, but offers um, kind of evidence that can be used in the service of normative arguments really, really well. Um, and so I think that's sort of how I think about sociology. Yeah.
That's great. Can you say maybe just a little bit more about like how that comes up like in concrete ways that that's shown up in some of your character programming? I think I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
So let me think about this. So I think that I think the first and foremost is this notion that um, character, the way we articulate a notion of character, and I think this goes back to the beauty and the joy and the justice, that character is a way of living one's life. It's not something that you deploy. And that a person who has a strong sense of character, for us, that's moral imagination and practical wisdom and courage to act. Those are ways that you are in a workplace. They are ways that you are with your family. They are ways that you are in your neighborhood. And I think it's this how to live a life of character is in many ways the orientation that we take and the approach that we use as we work with faculty who are doing this work, or we work with students who are doing that work.
Wonderful. At this point, I want to open the floor to the ECI community to raise questions. I'm going to monitor the chat, but I also would welcome anyone to raise their hand if they have a question that's burning that they want to ask at this space. So let me just give a moment for folks to either drop a question in the chat or raise their hand. If no one else has questions right away, I also have some additional questions I prepared that I'm happy to jump in. So, Liz, I see your hand.
Excuse me, Suzanne, thank you very much. This was encouraging and fascinating. And one of the things that occurred to me as you were speaking is that you've spent a lot of time bringing students and representatives of very wealthy institutions into close contact with folks who are facing a lot of vulnerability and risk. It seems like you've done that and you just keep on doing it. What guidance would you give to practitioners about how to navigate that challenge of like you're coming from a really wealthy institution and you've got people with a lot of need?
Yeah, I think I would say in my work with students in these situations, I am hyper didactic about the way we need to be. And I think, sort of emerging really from the 1990s, rise of service learning, community collaborations, community engagement, there is this notion, for example, that the community is a classroom, the community is a laboratory, that smart, bright, affluent students are here to save the day. I think that really we work to completely invert that relationship, and to say, really, we're here to do whatever it is you need doing if we would be of service. And so to really push against that, we work really hard and long about the skills of listening and the skills of observation. And I think here really training as, right, sociological training in participant observation and ethnography is really important. We are always looking at what is said and what is not said. That looking at the context of the environment that people are finding themselves in, and listening really deeply and carefully at what folks are saying, and not coming in with preformed ideas where I think with assumptions of what's going on. And I think that means that work is much slower. It's much more methodical. I think it can be much more frustrating. I think, but it sort of foregrounds an approach of humility that seems super essential. And there are little things that one of the things that students are always a bit taken aback by is I say that if you are served something to eat or drink, wherever we are in the world, you will eat it and you will drink it. It doesn't matter if that water wasn't boiled, you will drink the water. It doesn't matter if you are a vegetarian, you will eat that meat because someone has provided an extraordinary gift to you of their time and of their largesse or lack thereof, and we're going to proceed. And I think it's those sorts of things that get us thinking differently about our positionality with a community member.
Thank you.
Other questions? Ross.
Hi. First of all, thank you for this. This is wonderful. As someone trained in clinical psychology and research psychology, I think I'm noticing and hearing you talk my bias towards small, incremental, bite-sized changes in character, and I've loved the example of adopting with a bunch of students a refugee family as a very bold, holistic way of jumping into a life of character. I was wondering if you could say maybe a little bit more about one, whether you do a little or both of those, and two, recommendations for maybe lessons you've learned from jumping into the bunch of students and ways you might set up larger, kind of all-encompassing experiences like that so that they result in the best, not just experience, but growth character-wise.
Yeah, so I think that in some sense, I draw heavily from the work of Henry Nouwen that talks about this notion of voluntary displacement and how whether it's bringing a family into your community or going into a community, how are we displacing ourselves and our assumptions and the way that we are? And I think this creates right? It creates a vulnerability. And I think in that moment of vulnerability, it creates an opportunity to grow and learn and be open in a way that it's often very, very challenging. And I think that was true with this family for me. I think it was true for the students. That there were many, many overwhelming and terrifying moments with this family. And there have been many overwhelming and terrifying moments when we've collected life story interviews, whether the Middle East or in East Africa or Southeast Asia. And that kind of discomfort creates, for me, this really fertile ground of learning and character growth. And I think certainly that wasn't my goal when we did this. I was really thinking, oh, this would be like a nice experience. And I had this very idealistic notion of what was possible. I think that total environments have the greatest capacity for total change in someone. I think that there are also like incremental ways that you can proceed. So one of the things that happened after this experience with these students, and as we grew the program and more students participated, this became something that we did on Tuesdays and Saturdays. And so students would spend 3 to 4 hours on Tuesdays and Saturdays in some configuration. And that that framework was much more titrated, where they partnered more closely with a smaller set of individuals, tried to figure out what a particular family needed and how to proceed that way. And it wasn't quite so all-encompassing. So I think that incremental approach works as well. But I do think there's something extraordinary about being sort of, especially for students in affluent environments or students who have always been successful, to be in a space where success is not going to look like what you aspired to, and really you're out of your depth, and it's scary. And I think in that, extraordinary things can happen.
There's a question in the chat that I want to bring forward. This is from Heidi. Heidi writes, your research explores how displaced persons navigate moral boundaries and sustain community in the face of profound insecurity. In the US, many first-generation and low-income students experience similar forms of vulnerability, such as food insecurity, reliance on government programs like SNAP, to support their families and themselves. How might the insights from your work with families facing displacement inform how we think about supporting students who struggle with these issues here at home? And how can universities cultivate character and community in ways that acknowledge the moral and emotional complexities of living with such instability?
So I think this is a super interesting question, because one of the most significant findings in our research is that when we think about trauma of displaced persons, we think about being purged from your home, right? The death of family members, and right, what that experience is like. What increasingly much of the evidence shows is that that trauma is extraordinary, but the trauma of insecurity, of being in a liminal state, whether it's a refugee community or coming to the United States and not knowing how to get a job, is actually creates greater trauma, greater long-term anxiety and depression. One of the things that we did with this community of refugees and young people was to survey them all together. And so students at a wealthy university, along with community members, using an instrument called the RHS-15, which is a refugee health screener. It measures mental health, anxiety, depression levels. It's a fairly kind of crude instrument. But one of the things that was really interesting was the extent to which Duke students self-described much higher levels of anxiety and depression than the refugee community. And one of the things we also realized was that this varied dramatically by sort of socioeconomic status. So there were many Duke students, so even at an affluent university, who were struggling financially, had come from families with food insecurity, housing insecurity, et cetera. And that those things were really interrelated in terms of their mental health. So I think two things, and I'm getting a bit confused here, two things that I think are really important is one, that oftentimes students who come to a university with those experiences tend to, on the surface, exhibit higher levels of resilience. But that over time, that insecurity corrodes the resilience, leads to longer term problems with anxiety and depression. And so I think for university educators, the first thing is to be really aware of how corrosive food insecurity and housing insecurity are. I was speaking just yesterday with a student that's experienced significant housing insecurity, and that it's not like it's a crisis and then it goes away. It's something that sort of just really eats away at your sense of self in ways that you wouldn't expect. And so I think the first thing for us is to be able to understand the implications of that, but also to be able to identify it and find ways to support students who are experiencing it. Weirdly, students, there's an inverse relationship between sort of character formation in many settings, and socioeconomic status. So oftentimes it's students who have experienced something very, very challenging, who self-describe on various metrics as having higher levels of character. And I think that's to a certain extent true. Oftentimes it's mediated by religion or other kinds of community and social networks, but um, I have found working with displaced populations around the world, some of the most extraordinary individuals are individuals who've experienced unspeakable things. They are the most compassionate, the most generous, the most thoughtful, and have the greatest commitment to justice in this world in a way that you would expect really the opposite.
I have a question that came up in a private mention. Earlier in one of your answers, you mentioned this sort of life story interview as an
Mhm.
approach, and I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about that and about
Yep.
sort of how it shaped your own thinking about the work that you do.
Yeah, so a life story interview is a very open-ended interview structure. So we generally ask 5 questions. Uh, Describe a typical day, 7 most significant events in your life, describe your family, friends, social networks, describe sort of your sense of well-being, overall health, and then if your life were a book, what would be the title? These are interviews that generally last between 2 and 12 hours. They are completely respondent driven. And this was really developed for refugees in particular, though we use it for persons who've been trafficked. And it's completely open-ended because refugees have gone through refugee status determination, where someone fact checks everything they say, so that they can be assured that really they're not scamming, they're an actual refugee. And so this is an opportunity for people to tell their story however they want. So we don't care if in part of the interview you talk about 3 brothers and then you talk about 2. We're not going to query it. We're going to let you talk. And I think that it's also an interview that people have described as semi-therapeutic because they get to tell their story in ways that actually make them feel good about their life. Many of these interviews with people who have experienced the unimaginable are about the lemon trees they had in their backyard. They're about the first time they fell in love. They're about the taste of their water in the home. They're about the kind of prosaic things in one's life. And there is extraordinary beauty. There is lots of laughter. They're a way that people can try to make sense of how they found themselves in an unimaginable situation. And I think there's just such extraordinary beauty and joy and empowerment in having an interview that's like that. Um, and yeah, these are some of the most extraordinary conversations I've had with any human in my lifetime, is hearing a person talk about their life. For many refugees, they never mention what happened to them in their home country. They never mention their tale of displacement. It may come out in strange ways, but we let people tell the story of their life the way they want to tell it. And there's something very joyous in that.
We're drawing near to the end of our time. I see one more question I want to slip in before we wrap up for today. This is from Anne in the chat. She says, your work is outstanding through the lens of character building. You help facilitate your students from empathy to active human caring. What are some ways that the students are sustaining their character journey?
So I think for us, the goal is to cultivate a lifelong commitment to character and justice. And this means 2 things. One is how through experiences do we follow up on those experiences? So you can have a transformative experience, but if there aren't tethers to that, when you come back to a campus or you go off to your job, right? That's going to quickly dissipate. So how do we structure tethers? So opportunities when students come back to campus to continue to be part of a community and a set of conversations. Also, how do we do that when they go off and have a job? So I'm part of an ongoing book club several of whom are students who participated in this very first crazy experiment, where we read together, we talk about what we're trying to achieve, that there are conversations about how you're pursuing a vocation or a calling that speaks to the kind of person you want to be in the world. And to create spaces where students feel it's okay to say, out loud, like, I really feel I need this, but I want to pursue that, and how to create those spaces. So I think that's part of it. But I think it's also then to give people tools. So if we think of character and justice as aligned, um, how do you go off in the world and have a hard conversation in a workplace where something doesn't seem right? Kind of the Mary Gentile way of thinking, giving voice to values. But how do you have a conversation at a school board meeting that's productive? How do you think about legislative advocacy? How do you use the arts to support transformation in your own community? So to pair it with spaces that reinforce the importance of character over time, but also to give people the tools of what this looks like. Because I think, many students pop into a space and they can discern that something doesn't seem really right or just or fair, but they don't know what to do about it. They're worried how they're going to articulate it. And so really giving students the tools of how to be that person in the world very specifically and clearly, and give them an opportunity to practice those tools is really critical as well.
So we're at the near end of our time today. Before I offer Suzanne a chance to offer some concluding remarks, I wanted to slip in a brief advertisement for an opportunity at Virtues and Vocations. So if you go to their website, you'll see there's an open call for applications for a faculty development opportunity called Integrating Virtues Together. It's an opportunity for faculty across the nation who want to join a community of practice centered on infusing virtues into their courses. So the deadline for that is approaching within about a month. I think December 13th is the deadline for that opportunity. So I wanted to make sure I said that as an opportunity. So please take advantage of that with the folks at the Institute for Social Concerns. I want to give you a chance, Suzanne, to offer some concluding remarks. As I was thinking about this, our whole series this fall has been about character for, with, and in community. And I was jotting notes down as you were responding to questions today. Some words that popped out from the very beginning. You said walking alongside, right? You talked about proximity. You've talked about hospitality, joy, and beauty, and all of these are sort of interconnected deeply with justice. And so I wonder if you sort of at the end, if you just want to comment on these ideas as sort of the nexus or the integration of these ideas as you think about them in the work that you're doing today.
Yeah, I think of first and foremost, the cultivation of character is a shared exercise. This isn't something I can cultivate character alone in my office. And so I think um, being part of being part of a community that's committed to this, being part of a community that may not be committed to it, but is trying to figure it out. Uh, I, I, again, thinking of Ross Gay, when he talks about joy, he talks about your tragedy and my tragedy coming together. And that's what joy is. I think of the kind of work of Daniel Berrigan, the Jesuit priest, who said, if you want to be hopeful, do hopeful things. I think that the kind of collaboration around this is the essential piece, that it's essential as a mode of experimentation. I think there are ways that we know evidence-based practices that work, but I think knowing how to cultivate character that sticks and lasts a lifetime is still very much an open question. And we need to be hyper experimental, we need to be collaborative, and need to enjoy that work and think it's meaningful and important. And yeah, I love doing this every single day. Do I think I do it really well every day? Not a chance. Do I think I'm tinkering toward a utopia? Maybe. Uh, but yeah, but it's the joy of fellow travelers. It's no fun to go to Paris alone.
That's a great place to wrap things up for today. Suzanne, thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you for your wisdom. Thank you for what insights you've offered today for the fellow travelers that are on this call. Thank you to the community members who joined us today. We'll be posting that video within the next week. And just as a quick reminder, there's a bunch of stuff in the chat for you to follow up on. Join the community, register for a future webinar. Again, thank you so much for your time with us today, and we'll see you next time.
Great. Thank you so much.